The movie JFK really begins with Jim Garrison, who is a much maligned figure, even by people in the research community who bought into a lot of the things that were said about him and who may have been frustrated and sometimes in actually dealing with him. Jim Garrison was a bigger-than-life figure. I knew him very well. I worked with him for 2 years on his book, On the Trail of the Assassins, which is how the movie began. It really began because despite Jim Garrison being maligned as a Southern caricature, Gothic kind of guy and a ambitious politician and all these, corrupt media crazy, mafia, taking bribes from mafia, fondling little boys. Everything was said about this man, and unfortunately, at the time, it wasn't clear that this was an orchestrated campaign to smear him. Up until he uttered 3 little letters, CIA, Garrison was a very popular man, revered in the press, revered in New Orleans, a crime fighter, a model citizen, 23 years in the military, former FBI agent, hardly a flaming radical by any means. But as soon as he uttered those 3 little letters, everything changed. We now know, because of a CIA memo that was made public under the Freedom of Information Act, we know that there was an orchestrated campaign to smear the critics of the Warren Commission. At the time, Mark Lane and Jim Garrison were the most prominent of those. And in that memo, the CIA station chiefs are directed to use their media assets to write stories in the press that expose the critics as financially interested, politically motivated, careless in their research, paranoid and crazy, and so forth. Sound familiar? This is exactly the portrait that emerged of Jim Garrison. Jim Garrison was forgotten for a long time. He wrote this book on his own, and it was ready to go 2 years before the 25th anniversary of the assassination, which was 1988. But he wrote the book as a historical document, as a piece of history. The publisher who commissioned it rejected the book. They said every chapter was great, and then they said, we can't publish this. Garrison was convinced that the CIA had interfered in that process, and he, in turn, took his manuscript and went to a small publisher in New York named Sheridan Square Press, and I worked as an editor for that press. That press specialized in books about the CIA, by former CIA agents mostly. And in working on that manuscript, we reworked the book so that it became a whodunit, told from the first person, Garrison's own experience of his investigation. That book was published in 1988, didn't get any reviews in any of the major press. It got 1 paragraph in the New York Times with several other books in review, because Garrison was essentially dismissed as this kook from the 60s. However, the publishers met Oliver Stone in an elevator at the Havana Film Festival in Cuba, handed him the book, and Oliver Stone read it, decided he wanted to make a movie. He was busy on another movie, Born on the 4th of July, and he asked the publishers who he could get going on the book. They recommended me, and I started working on the screenplay. He hired me over the telephone, and I spent the next year doing additional interviews and, of course, working from Garrison's manuscript plus Garrison's other memories. I interviewed him extensively and those of his staff who remained alive and accessible. We did over 200 interviews. One of the main researchers, Bob Spiegelman, is here tonight. He's someone you may want to talk to about the work that went into this. There were a lot of people doing research. A lot of the work came not just from Garrison and from Stone and from me, but from citizen researchers who had done a lot of work over the years. Jim Mars's book, Crossfire, was acquired by Oliver because he wanted to make sure that the information that had been learned over the past 25 years that Garrison did not have access to in 1968 and 1969 when the trial was going on could be put into the film. He wanted modern-day audiences to have the benefit of cumulative knowledge that mainstream journalists had not informed them of, but that citizen researchers had been doing for all those years. So a lot of that information is incorporated in JFK, and in that context, it raises the question, how literally accurate and factual is the film? We put out a book called the Book of the Film, JFK, the Book of the Film. That is a source-noted screenplay, and it also has a number of articles after the film was released. But those source notes tell you where we got the stuff that's in the film. It also tells you where there is speculation. It also tells you where there is composited characters, and it also tells you where information that was not known at the time has been put into the film. A good example of that is one of the key scenes in the film, is the scene with Donald Sutherland, Mr. X, which Garrison did not actually meet the person who that stuff is based on, named Fletcher Prouty. He didn't meet him in 1969. He didn't meet him until after his book came out in 1988. What he did do was he met with another character named Richard Case Nagel in a similar setup. A mysterious guy calls and says he's from an agency he can't name. He has information about the assassination. He wants to meet in a park. They met in Central Park in New York, not in Washington. We switched that for obvious reasons to have it more, have more significance set against the Washington Monument and so Lincoln Memorial. But Nagel's story was a wild story that Garrison could not check out and did not end up using. However, Fletcher Prouty's story came out when he wrote a letter in 1988 to Garrison saying, well, this is what you were doing in New Orleans, let me tell you what was happening to me. And in this letter in 1988, he lays out essentially the story that he tells in the movie as Mr. X. So did Garrison know that stuff in 1969? No. Is it literally true? No. Is it historically and essentially accurate? Absolutely. The stuff that's in that scene is documented from various sources, but mainly based on the interviews that we did with Fletcher Prouty and his own experience. But you could make the argument Jim Garrison did not know that at the time. Similarly, there are composite characters in the film. The character played by Kevin Bacon, who is a prisoner who gets into a whole homosexual incident with Clay Shaw and describes a party at which the Cubans and Oswald are there, and they're discussing, and David Ferry and Shaw, that they're discussing the assassination. That is a composite of four different characters, actually, some of which Garrison did not use at his trial, but we had sworn affidavits from them, and we used we tried to stick almost exactly to the language that these people used in their sworn affidavits. Two of them had been at Clay Shaw's residence. One described having dinner at a long table, just the way he describes in the film. Another one of them had been paid for sex by Shaw. And then the other one was Perry Russo, who actually was the main witness for Garrison at the trial. And he described the whole incident with the Cubans and David Ferry and Shaw and Oswald at this party. So that's the kind of thing that we did that the critics latched onto and said, well, this film takes dramatic license. The measure that we used was basically not whether something was literally, factually correct, but whether it was honest and true essentially. So that whether or not three of these people had we could have had three different scenes with three different people saying these different things, but by compositing into one, we made it a much more dramatic scene, and it remained, I believe, essentially true. Similarly with just as a lesson in screenwriting, the scene with Jack Lemmon at the racetrack is a scene that I wrote based on Garrison's memories of his interviews with Jack Martin, this detective who hung around with Oswald and Bannister in the summer of '63 in New Orleans. That scene I wrote the way Garrison described it to me, which was as an interview between Garrison and Jack Martin in Garrison's office. The same dialogue is used, the same content. It goes in and out of descriptions of what was going on that summer. All the same words, but when I got that script back from Oliver Stone, who had rewritten it, that scene was set at the racetrack. Well, was it literally true? No. But essentially true? Absolutely. Not only was it more dramatic because you had a more interesting setting and you had the drama of the hoofs, which highlighted certain dramatic parts of the scene, but it also was truer to Jack Martin's character. It brought out the kind of person that we were actually dealing with. This guy was an alcoholic, gumshoe, and this is exactly the kind of place he would have been at a racetrack watching the morning workouts. So in a sense, it deepened the character. It did what a fictional film can do that a documentary cannot do. Documentary has its virtue. Obviously, it tells you what actually happened, but a fictional film has a different way of approaching things, and it can, in some ways, deepen the truth, not just subvert it. We were often accused in the media when the film came out of subverting the truth. Newsweek ran a cover story that called it "The Twisted Truth of JFK." And I had the privilege of speaking to the researcher for Newsweek before that cover story came out, and she told me that they were going to say that Jim Garrison had never set foot in the courtroom during the Clay Shaw trial. And I pointed out to her that it was true that Garrison had not conducted the whole trial. He had left most of that to his assistants because he did not want himself to be the focus of attention. He knew that he was already a media circus figure, and he wanted the focus to be on Clay Shaw and on the facts of the case. So he let his assistants do most of the trial work. However, Garrison did give an opening statement, and he did give a closing statement. 80% of the closing statement in the film is taken directly from Jim Garrison's own words in his own closing statement to the actual jury at the trial. And I pointed this out to the Newsweek researcher. I said, don't believe me. Go to the court, get the transcript, look for yourself. Sure enough, 2 days later, the magazine comes out. Jim Garrison never set foot in the courtroom. And this is the Newsweek telling us that we've twisted the facts of JFK, twisted truth of JFK. This happened many times, we had a lot of criticism, as Cyril Wecht pointed out, from journalists whose careers were made that day in Dallas. Dan Rather, Tom Wicker, Dick Stolley, as Jerry Polikoff pointed out. They were all, Robert McNeil, they were all young reporters at the time. Their careers took off that day, and they took off because they basically adopted the Oswald, the lone nut, did it theory. What we call this is cognitive dissonance. You know, once you establish a position and you rise up high in the ranks, these people went to the top of their profession, you don't just give it up readily. And that's what happened. It's impossible to shake someone like Dan Rather out of his position. And they were rewarded handsomely for continuing to report as they had. So this is the kind of thing that we were up against. Tom Wicker wrote a column condemning the film because it made people question the United States government. I wrote him a long letter saying, well, you know, in my view of this country, the government doesn't deserve to be trusted just automatically. It has to earn the trust of the people. If it doesn't earn the trust of the people have the right to get rid of that government. That's the way I understand democracy. But he was insulted that somehow we'd made people doubt the credibility of the United States government. He never answered the letter. The film got a lot of attention. It stirred up a lot of controversy. My own theory about it is that it wasn't so much that it's a great mystery story, which obviously it is, and that's why we're all interested in it, but also I feel that what it did was it opened up a raw wound that had been in the American psyche for a long time, and that didn't deal just with the assassination. I think there was a cumulative rage building in the population, and this movie was released in 1991 when George Bush was president at first, and we'd seen an accumulation of, beginning with the assassination, of outrages and lies from the government, beginning with the Vietnam War, where they coined the term credibility gap, going through Watergate, the cover-ups, the lies from Nixon, going through the Iran-Contra affair and the cover-up there. And I think what had happened was that there was a cumulative rage. And in fact, I myself was quite jaded about the whole thing, where it got to the point where I just said to myself, you know, the government lies, that's just the way it is, and we're never going to be able to do anything about it. The one great thing about Jim Garrison was that he was totally outraged, even 25 years after the fact. And his rage, he couldn't understand why people weren't out in the streets, you know, demonstrating and at the outrage that their government had been stolen from them. That rage really, it meant something to me, and it touched me, and it made me actually work on the book originally. And I think what happened with the movie is that it touched a raw nerve with people that was far beyond the assassination. I think it spoke to a lot of people about an ongoing secret government that we have to do something about, that we have to get control of. And I think that's why people flooded Congress with letters asking that those closed files be opened up. And that's why we got the law creating the Assassination Records Review Board, and that's why we got 2 million pages of documents. Now, I'm not a great believer that there are not a lot of documents that still exist. I also believe that a lot of documents, we've seen how Oliver North dealt with documents. They shredded the important ones. I'm sure that's happened also. However, that much said, we still have to push for more openness and to get all the information we can. And as I said earlier, I'm a great believer in absolutely dismantling the CIA because I think those kind of secret organizations are just a counter to anything that I consider to be a democratic institution. And anyway, the film came out, we got that law passed, and here we are. 10 years later, a lot of stuff has happened, and over the next few days, people will be talking about a lot of the information that came out as a result.